Sarah Martinez adjusted her white dress one final time as she stood outside the small chapel in downtown Phoenix. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the modest venue, and despite the butterflies in her stomach, she felt genuinely happy. After 3 years of dating, she and Michael Thompson were finally getting married. It wasn't the grand wedding she had dreamed of as a little girl, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. Michael emerged from the chapel, looking handsome in his navy suit. His warm smile immediately calmed Sarah's nerves. They had chosen this intimate ceremony deliberately, wanting something simple and meaningful rather than an expensive spectacle. Only their closest friends and immediate family members were present, exactly as they had planned. The ceremony proceeded beautifully. Pastor Jenkins, who had known Sarah's family for years, delivered a heartfelt service that brought tears to several guests' eyes. When Michael and Sarah exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through all of life's challenges, there wasn't a dry eye in the small chapel. The photographer they had hired captured every precious moment, from their nervous laughter during the ring exchange to their passionate kiss that sealed their union. As the newlyweds walked down the aisle hand in hand, rice and rose petals showered them from their delighted guests. Sarah's mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while Michael's father clapped enthusiastically. Everything seemed perfect, just as they had envisioned. The couple posed for photos outside the chapel, their faces glowing with joy and excitement about their future together. However, their perfect day took an unexpected turn during the reception. The small banquet hall they had rented was decorated with simple white flowers and soft lighting. Guests mingled happily, enjoying the modest but delicious buffet dinner. Sarah and Michael moved from table to table, thanking everyone for coming and sharing in their special moment. It was during the cake-cutting ceremony that things began to go wrong. A man in a dark suit approached their table, his expression serious and official. He introduced himself as Detective Rodriguez from the HFY Phoenix Police Department. Sarah's heart immediately began racing, wondering if something had happened to a family member or if there had been an emergency. The detective explained that there had been a complaint filed about their wedding. Someone had reported suspicious activity at the chapel, claiming that the ceremony appeared to be fraudulent. Sarah and Michael exchanged confused glances, unable to understand who would make such an accusation or why. The detective was polite, but firm, explaining that he needed to verify their identities and the legitimacy of their marriage. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as other guests began to notice the commotion. Michael squeezed her hand reassuringly, telling the detective that they were happy to cooperate with any investigation. They provided their driver's licenses and marriage certificate, which Pastor Jenkins had just completed moments before. The detective examined their documents carefully, taking notes in a small notebook. He asked basic questions about how they met, how long they had been together, and why they had chosen this particular venue. Sarah answered each question honestly, though she couldn't shake the feeling that their magical wedding day was being ruined by someone's malicious complaint. As Detective Rodriguez continued his preliminary questioning, Sarah noticed her new mother-in-law looking increasingly uncomfortable. Michael's mother kept glancing at her watch and shifting in her seat. When the detective asked to speak with the immediate family members, she suddenly excused herself to use the restroom and didn't return for nearly 15 minutes. The atmosphere in the reception hall had shifted dramatically. What began as a celebration filled with laughter and joy now felt tense and uncertain. Guests whispered among themselves, trying to understand what was happening. Sarah's younger sister approached and asked if everything was okay, but Sarah honestly didn't know how to answer. Michael remained calm throughout the questioning, his steady presence helping Sarah maintain her composure. He assured the detective that their marriage was completely legitimate and offered to provide any additional documentation that might be needed. The detective appreciated their cooperation but explained that he would need to conduct a more thorough investigation back at the station. As the evening wore on, it became clear that their wedding reception was effectively over. Guests began leaving, offering awkward congratulations and promises to call soon. Sarah's parents stayed behind to help clean up, their faces showing a mixture of concern and confusion about the day's strange turn of events. The next morning, Sarah woke up in their hotel room feeling like the previous day had been a nightmare. She had barely slept, replaying the detective's questions over and over in her mind. Michael was already awake, sitting by the window with his phone in his hand, looking troubled. He had received a call from Detective Rodriguez requesting that they come to the police station for additional questioning. Sarah's stomach churned as they drove to the Phoenix Police Department. She kept asking Michael if he had any idea who might have filed the complaint, or why someone would want to disrupt their wedding. Michael shook his head, genuinely puzzled by the entire situation. He had been living in Phoenix for 5 years, and couldn't think of anyone who would want to cause them trouble. At the police station, they were escorted to a small interview room. Detective Rodriguez was joined by another officer, Detective Williams, who specialized in fraud investigations. The atmosphere felt much more serious than the previous evening's casual questioning. Sarah's hands trembled as she placed them on the metal table, and Michael reached over to steady her. Detective Williams began by explaining that the complaint had included specific details about their relationship that seemed inconsistent. The anonymous caller had claimed that Sarah and Michael's relationship was fabricated, and that they were using the marriage for illegal purposes. Sarah felt her face flush with anger at the accusation, but Michael squeezed her hand, silently urging her to remain calm. The detectives asked detailed questions about their relationship timeline. They wanted to know exactly when and where they had first met, who had introduced them, and what their first date had been like. Sarah answered every question honestly, describing how they had met at a coffee shop near Arizona State University, where she was finishing her nursing degree. However, as the questioning continued, some inconsistencies began to emerge in their stories. Michael mentioned that their first date had been at a Mexican restaurant, while Sarah remembered it being at an Italian place. These small discrepancies, which would be normal for any couple recalling events from years ago, seemed to raise red flags for the investigators. Detective Rodriguez then asked to see their phones, claiming they needed to verify the timeline of their relationship through text messages and photos. Sarah willingly handed over her phone, confident that their 3 years of messages and pictures would prove their genuine relationship. Michael seemed more hesitant, but eventually complied with the request. While the detectives examined their phones in another room, Sarah and Michael sat in uncomfortable silence. Sarah couldn't understand why someone would make such serious accusations against them. She wondered if it might be related to Michael's ex-girlfriend, who had been bitter about their breakup, but Michael insisted that wasn't possible. When the detectives returned, their expressions were even more serious. Detective Williams explained that their preliminary investigation had revealed some concerning information. They had run background checks on both Sarah and Michael, and while Sarah's record showed exactly what they expected for a nursing student, Michael's background was more complicated. The detective revealed that Michael Thompson had no employment records in Phoenix prior to 5 years ago. There were no tax records, no previous addresses, and no educational transcripts that could be verified. It was as if Michael had simply appeared in Phoenix 5 years ago, with no prior history. Sarah stared at her new husband in shock, unable to understand how this was possible. Michael's face went pale as the detective continued reading from his notes. The social security number Michael had been using showed inconsistencies with federal databases. His driver's license, while valid, had been issued as a replacement for a license that supposedly existed in another state, but there were no records of that original license. Sarah felt like the room was spinning. She looked at Michael, searching, his face for an explanation, but he appeared as confused and frightened as she felt. He stammered that there must be some mistake, that he had always been honest about his background. He mentioned that his family had moved around a lot when he was younger, which might explain some of the missing records. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward, his tone becoming more direct. He explained that they had contacted the Social Security Administration, and there were serious questions about Michael's identity documents. The investigation was no longer just about a complaint regarding their wedding. It had become a potential case of identity fraud. The room fell silent as the weight of the situation settled over them. Sarah realized that their perfect wedding day had been just the beginning of what was turning into a nightmare. She didn't know whether to feel angry, scared, or heartbroken. The man she had just married, the man she thought she knew everything about, was apparently hiding secrets that even the police couldn't unravel. Michael finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He told the detectives that he wanted to cooperate fully with their investigation, but he genuinely didn't understand what was wrong with his documents. He had been using the same identification for years without any problems. He had gotten jobs, rented apartments, and even passed background checks for previous employment. As the interview concluded, Detective Williams informed them that they would need to remain available for further questioning. Michael's documents would be sent to federal agencies for more extensive verification. Sarah felt like she was living in a movie, unable to believe that her new marriage was already under investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself living in a strange limbo. She had taken time off work for their honeymoon, but instead of relaxing on a beach somewhere, she was sitting in their apartment watching Michael pace nervously while they waited for updates from the police. Every phone call made her jump, wondering if it would bring good news or make their situation even worse. Michael had become increasingly withdrawn, spending hours on his laptop trying to research what might have gone wrong with his documents. Sarah watched him with growing concern, noticing how he flinched every time there was a knock at the door, or when his phone buzzed with a notification. The confident, easygoing man she had married seemed to be disappearing before her eyes. On Wednesday morning, Detective Rodriguez called and asked them to come back to the station. He explained that the federal investigation had uncovered additional information that required immediate attention. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that their problems were far from over. She had been hoping that it would turn out to be a simple bureaucratic error that could be quickly resolved. At the police station, they were joined by Agent Patricia Chen from the FBI. Sarah's knees felt weak when she heard that federal agents were now involved in their case. Agent Chen explained that Michael's identity documents had been flagged in multiple federal databases, and there were serious concerns about their authenticity. The agent revealed that the Social Security number Michael had been using belonged to someone else entirely. The real owner of that number was a man named David Mitchell who had died in a car accident in Oregon 15 years ago. Michael's face went completely white as he heard this information, and Sarah felt like she might be sick. Agent Chen continued, explaining that using a deceased person's Social Security number was a serious federal crime that could result in years in prison. She asked Michael directly if he had any knowledge about how he had obtained these false documents. Michael shook his head vigorously, insisting that he had no idea his documents were fraudulent. Sarah found herself wondering if the man she had married was a complete stranger. She studied his face, looking for any sign that he was lying, but he appeared genuinely shocked and terrified by these revelations. Part of her wanted to stand by him, but another part was beginning to doubt everything she thought she knew about their relationship. The investigation took another dramatic turn when Agent Chen revealed that they had been in contact with Michael's supposed family members. She explained that they had tracked down the address he had provided for his parents, but the people living there claimed they had never heard of Michael Thompson. The phone numbers he had given for family members were either disconnected or belonged to people who denied knowing him. Sarah gasped audibly when she heard this. She had met Michael's parents several times over the past 3 years. His mother had helped her choose flowers for the wedding, and his father had given a toast at their rehearsal dinner. How could these people be claiming they didn't know Michael? The whole situation was becoming more surreal by the minute. Michael stammered that there must be some mistake, that his family had probably just moved and changed their phone numbers. But when Agent Chen showed him the official records, his story began to fall apart. The house he claimed to have grown up in had been owned by the same family for over 20 years, and they had never heard of anyone named Thompson living there. The questioning continued. More inconsistencies emerged in Michael's background story. The college he claimed to have attended had no records of a Michael Thompson graduating in the year he specified. The previous jobs he had mentioned on his resume either didn't exist or had no record of employing him under that name. Sarah felt like she was in a nightmare that kept getting worse. She realized that virtually everything Michael had told her about his past might be completely fabricated, The man she had fallen in love with and married was apparently someone entirely different from who she thought he was. She didn't know whether to feel angry, betrayed, or simply heartbroken. Agent. Chen then asked Sarah to step out of the room so they could speak with Michael privately. As Sarah sat in the waiting area, she tried to process everything that was happening. She wondered if their entire relationship had been built on lies, or if Michael was somehow an innocent victim of identity theft himself. Through the glass window, she could see Michael talking animatedly with the agents, his hands gesturing as if he was trying to explain something important. His body language suggested that he was becoming increasingly desperate to convince them of something, but Sarah couldn't hear what was being said. After what felt like hours, Agent Chen called Sarah back into the room. Michael's eyes were red, and he looked like he had been crying. The agent explained that Michael had requested to speak with a lawyer before answering any more questions, which was certainly his right. But it also suggested that the situation was more serious than they had initially believed. As they prepared to leave the police station, Agent Chen warned them that Michael should not attempt to leave the city while the investigation was ongoing. His passport would be flagged, and any attempt to flee would be considered an admission of guilt. Sarah felt like she was living in a crime drama, unable to believe that her new husband was now essentially a fugitive who couldn't travel. During the quiet drive home, Sarah finally asked Michael the question that had been burning in her mind all day. She wanted to know who he really was and whether anything he had told her about himself was actually true. Michael was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking, and what he said would change everything she thought she knew about their relationship. Michael pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. His hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, and Sarah could see tears forming in his eyes. When he finally began to speak, his voice was barely above a whisper, and Sarah had to strain to hear his words over the sound of passing traffic. He told her that his real name wasn't Michael Thompson. He was actually Marcus Rivera, and he had been living under a false identity for the past 8 years. Sarah felt her world crashing down around her as she realized that she had married a complete stranger. The man she thought she knew, the man she had fallen in love with, didn't actually exist. Marcus explained that when he was 17 years old, he had witnessed a brutal murder in his hometown of Tucson. The victim had been a local businessman who had been trying to expose corruption in the city government. Marcus had seen the killer's faces clearly and had initially planned to go to the police with what he knew. However, before he could contact the authorities, someone broke into his family's home and left a threatening note. The message was clear. If Marcus talked to the police, his entire family would be killed. His younger sister was only 12 years old at the time, and his parents were terrified for their lives. The family realized that they were dealing with powerful people who had extensive connections. Sarah listened in stunned silence as Marcus continued his story. He explained that his father had a friend who worked in law enforcement, someone who had helped other witnesses disappear when their lives were in danger. This contact had provided Marcus with the false identity documents that had allowed him to start a new life in Phoenix under the name Michael Thompson. The plan had been for Marcus to lay low for a few years until the corruption investigation was completed and the dangerous people were arrested. He was supposed to eventually return to his real identity and reunite with his family. However, the investigation had dragged on for years, and the corrupt officials had never been brought to justice. Marcus told Sarah that he had initially planned to tell her the truth about his identity after they had been dating for a few months. But as their relationship became more serious, he found himself falling deeply in love with her, and he was terrified that she would leave him if she knew he was living under a false name. Sarah felt a mixture of emotions washing over her. She was angry that Marcus had lied to her for 3 years, but she was also beginning to understand the impossible situation he had been in. He hadn't chosen to live under a false identity for criminal purposes. He had been trying to protect his family from dangerous people. Marcus reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small manila envelope. Inside were photographs of his real family, including his parents and younger sister. He also had newspaper clippings about the murder he had witnessed and the ongoing corruption investigation in Tucson. Sarah studied the documents, seeing that everything he was telling her appeared to be true. The photographs showed a younger version of Marcus at family gatherings and school events. Sarah could see the resemblance, but there were subtle differences in his appearance that she now realized were the result of years of living in fear. The carefree teenager in the photos had become the cautious, sometimes distant man she had married. Marcus explained that he had been sending money to his family through a complicated system that protected their location. His parents had been forced to move several times over the years, always staying one step ahead of the people who wanted to silence their son. They had been living like refugees in their own country, unable to have normal lives because of what Marcus had witnessed. Sarah asked why he hadn't gone to the FBI or federal authorities who might have been able to provide official witness protection. Marcus explained that the corruption in Tucson had involved federal agents as well as local officials. His father's contact had warned them that they couldn't trust anyone in law enforcement, which was why they had chosen to handle the situation privately. As Sarah processed this information, she began to understand why the anonymous complaint about their wedding had been so devastating. Someone had apparently discovered Marcus's real identity and had decided to expose him. The question now was whether this person was connected to the original threat against his family, or if it was simply a case of bad timing. Marcus told Sarah that he had been living in constant fear for 8 years, always looking over his shoulder and wondering if someone was watching him. He had avoided forming close relationships because he was afraid of putting other people in danger. Meeting Sarah had been the first time he had felt truly happy since leaving his old life behind. Sarah realized that many of the things she had, interpreted as personality quirks, now made perfect sense. Marcus was always careful about being photographed. He never wanted to travel to certain parts of Arizona, and he had always been vague about his childhood memories. She had thought he was just a private person, but now she understood that he had been protecting a dangerous secret. The weight of the situation began to sink in as Sarah realized that their problems were much bigger than identity fraud. If the wrong people discovered that Marcus Rivera was alive and living in Phoenix, both of their lives could be in serious danger. The police investigation that had started with a simple wedding complaint had potentially exposed them to the very threats Marcus had been hiding from for 8 years. Marcus looked at Sarah with desperate eyes, waiting to see how she would react to learning the truth about who he really was. He told her that he would understand if she wanted to annul their marriage and walk away from the complicated and dangerous situation he had brought into her life. Sarah sat quietly for several minutes, trying to process everything she had learned and decide what she wanted to do with this life-changing information. Sarah reached over and took Marcus's hand, surprising him with her gentle touch. Despite everything she had just learned, she found herself feeling more connected to him than ever before. She finally understood why he sometimes seemed distant or troubled, and why he had always been so protective of her. The man she had fallen in love with was real. He had just been carrying an incredible burden alone. She told Marcus that she wasn't going anywhere. While she was hurt that he had kept such a massive secret from her, she could understand why he had felt he had no choice. The teenage boy who had witnessed a murder and been forced to abandon his entire identity deserved compassion, not judgment. Sarah realized that Marcus had trusted her with his life by finally telling her the truth. They decided to drive back to the police station immediately. Sarah convinced Marcus that hiding from the investigation would only make things worse. If he was truly innocent of any wrongdoing and had been living under a false identity to protect himself and his family, then law enforcement needed to know the real story. The FBI agents might even be able to help him. At the police station, Agent Chen was surprised to see them return so quickly. When Marcus asked to speak with her privately and mentioned that he had new information about his identity, she immediately called for additional agents to join the meeting. Sarah could see that the situation was being taken very seriously by everyone involved. Marcus began by telling Agent Chen his real name and explaining the circumstances that had led to his false identity. He provided the photographs and newspaper clippings as evidence to support his story. The agent listened carefully, taking detailed notes and asking specific questions about the murder he had witnessed and the threats against his family. Agent Chen explained that Marcus's situation fell under federal witness protection guidelines, even though he hadn't gone through official channels. She assured him that if his story checked out, the FBI would work to protect both him and his family from any ongoing threats. However, she also warned that using fraudulent documents was still a serious crime that would need to be addressed. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Agent Chen revealed that the corruption case in Tucson was still active. Federal agents had been working for years to build cases against the officials Marcus had seen commit murder. His testimony could be the key evidence they needed to finally bring these dangerous people to justice. Marcus was both relieved and terrified to learn that his nightmare might finally be coming to an end. Agent Chen explained that they would need to verify his story by contacting the law enforcement officer who had helped him disappear 8 years ago. If everything checked out, Marcus would be entered into the official witness protection program, and his family would finally be safe. However, there was still the question of who had filed the anonymous complaint about their wedding. Agent Chen suspected that someone connected to the Tucson corruption case had discovered Marcus's location and was trying to expose him. This meant that both Marcus and Sarah were potentially in immediate danger. The FBI arranged for protective surveillance while they investigated the source of the wedding complaint. Sarah found herself living in a safe house with Marcus, surrounded by federal agents who were working around the clock to verify his story and identify the people who had threatened him. During their time in protective custody, Sarah learned even more details about Marcus's real life. She saw photographs of his childhood home and heard stories about his family that he had never been able to share before. She began to understand the tremendous sacrifice he had made by giving up his entire identity to protect the people he loved. Agent Chen's investigation moved quickly once they had Marcus's real name and background information. They were able to locate his father's contact in law enforcement, who confirmed every detail of Marcus's story. The corrupt officials in Tucson had indeed put out threats against the Rivera family, and helping Marcus disappear had been a desperate attempt to keep him alive. The breakthrough in the case came when FBI analysts traced the anonymous wedding complaint to a cell phone registered to one of the corrupt officials they had been investigating. This person had apparently been searching for Marcus Rivera for years, and somehow discovering his new identity in Phoenix had presented an opportunity to silence him permanently. Sarah realized that their wedding complaint had actually been the beginning of a trap. The corrupt officials had planned to use the police investigation to locate Marcus, and then they would have arranged for him to disappear permanently. The FBI intervention had probably saved both of their lives. As the federal investigation expanded, agents discovered evidence of an extensive criminal network that had been operating in Arizona for over a decade. Marcus's testimony about the murder he had witnessed was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, involving drug trafficking, money laundering, and government corruption. Agent Chen informed Marcus and Sarah that several arrests were imminent, and that the people who had been threatening the Rivera family for 8 years would finally face justice. However, she also warned them that the danger wasn't over yet. Until all the corrupt officials were in custody, Marcus and his family would need to remain under federal protection. The most emotional moment came when Agent Chen arranged for Marcus to speak with his parents and sister for the first time in 8 years. Sarah watched through tears as he broke down crying while talking to his family on a secure phone line. They had been living in fear just as long as he had, never knowing if they would see their son and brother again. Sarah realized that marrying Marcus hadn't just meant taking on his false identity problems. She had also inherited his wonderful but traumatized family. His parents expressed their gratitude to her for standing by their son during the most difficult time of his life, and his sister was excited about finally having a sister-in-law she could meet in person once the danger passed. 6 months after their disastrous wedding day, Sarah and Marcus found themselves in a federal courthouse in Phoenix, preparing to testify in one of the largest corruption trials in Arizona history. The FBI investigation had led to the arrest of 12 officials, including the people who had murdered the businessman Marcus had seen killed 8 years earlier. Marcus had spent weeks working with federal prosecutors, providing detailed testimony about everything he had witnessed. His photographic memory of the murder scene and the conversations he had overheard proved to be crucial evidence in building the government's case. Sarah was amazed by his courage in facing the people who had destroyed his teenage years and forced his family into hiding. The trial attracted national media attention, with reporters describing it as a landmark case in the fight against government corruption. Sarah watched from the gallery as Marcus took the witness stand, his voice strong and clear as he recounted the terrifying night that had changed his entire life. She felt incredibly proud of the man she had married, even though she was still getting used to calling him by his real name. The defense attorneys tried to discredit Marcus's testimony by pointing out that he had been living under a false identity for 8 years. However, the prosecutors had prepared for this attack and presented evidence showing that Marcus had been an innocent teenager who had been forced into hiding to protect his life. The jury seemed sympathetic to his situation rather than judgmental about his deception. During a recess in the trial, Agent Chen updated Sarah and Marcus on the status of their case. All charges against Marcus for using fraudulent identity documents had been dropped in exchange for his cooperation with the prosecution. The FBI had determined that he had been an innocent victim rather than a criminal, and his false identity had been a matter of survival rather than fraud. The most emotional day of the trial came when Marcus's parents and sister were finally able to travel to Phoenix to see him testify. Sarah watched as the Rivera family reunited for the first time in 8 years, embracing in the courthouse hallway with tears streaming down their faces. She realized that she wasn't just witnessing the end of a criminal trial. She was seeing a family being restored after years of separation and fear. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury delivered guilty verdicts against all 12 defendants. Marcus's eyewitness testimony had been the key evidence that convinced them of the defendants' guilt. The judge sentenced the murderers to life in prison and imposed substantial prison terms on the other corrupt officials who had participated in the cover-up. Following the trial, Sarah and Marcus faced the question of what to do about their identities going forward. The FBI offered to help Marcus legally change his name back to Marcus Rivera, but they also said he could choose to keep the Michael Thompson identity if he preferred. After much discussion, they decided that Marcus wanted to reclaim his real name and reconnect with his true identity. The process of transitioning from Michael Thompson back to Marcus Rivera proved to be complicated but manageable with the FBI's assistance. Sarah had to get used to introducing herself as Sarah Rivera instead of Sarah Thompson, but she found that she liked having a connection to Marcus's real family and heritage. His parents and sister welcomed her warmly, grateful that their son had found someone who loved him enough to stand by him during the worst crisis of his life. They decided to have a second wedding ceremony, this time with Marcus using his real name and with his entire family present. The small chapel in Phoenix held special meaning for them because it was where their journey toward the truth had begun, even though their first wedding day had turned into a nightmare. This time, there were no police officers or federal agents interrupting their celebration. Sarah's nursing career had been put on hold during the months of trials and investigation, but she was able to return to work once the case was concluded. She found that the experience had changed her perspective on life, making her more appreciative of ordinary moments of peace and happiness. The trauma of thinking she might lose Marcus had made their relationship stronger, rather than driving them apart. Marcus struggled initially with adjusting to life without constantly looking over his shoulder. After 8 years of living in fear, it was difficult for him to believe that the threat to his family was really over. With Sarah's support and some counseling, he gradually learned to relax and enjoy the freedom of being able to use his real name without fear. The couple eventually moved to a new apartment in a different part of Phoenix, wanting a fresh start that wasn't associated with the trauma of their first months of marriage. Marcus was able to find work using his real qualifications and work history, and Sarah continued advancing in her nursing career. They began talking about starting a family, something they had avoided discussing while living under the shadow of the investigation. 1 year after the trial ended, Sarah and Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Agent Chen stopped by their apartment to check on how they were adjusting to their new life. She brought news that the last of the corrupt officials had been sentenced and that the case was finally completely closed. She also mentioned that Marcus's testimony had helped prevent other potential witnesses from being intimidated or harmed. As Agent Chen prepared to leave, She thanked both Sarah and Marcus for their courage in seeing the case through to its conclusion. She told them that their willingness to trust law enforcement and tell the truth had helped restore justice and made their community safer. Sarah realized that their wedding complaint, which had seemed like such a disaster at the time, had ultimately led to something positive and meaningful. Looking back on their tumultuous first year of marriage, Sarah and Marcus both agreed that they had learned important lessons about trust, honesty, and the strength of their commitment to each other. The crisis that could have destroyed their relationship had instead proven that their love was strong enough to survive even the most extraordinary circumstances. They had literally faced life and death situations together and emerged with a deeper understanding of what marriage truly meant.